Hello and welcome back to another Rush Duel Links video. Today we're going to be taking a look at the meta and making a tier list based on where we think things stand with the release of the Ultimate Ace Breaker structure deck that has kind of come in and mixed things up a little bit. So again, this is going to be kind of subjective because it's kind of hard to make a tier list without it being at least somewhat subjective, but this will be supported primarily with tournament results and then a little bit of my own ladder experience thrown in, but again, primarily, we're always looking at tournament results, and the primary place where we've been getting those tournament results is Brand Harrier's Rush Duel events, which he hosts over on his Twitch channel every Sunday that we ourselves do tend to partake in, although we have been playing quite memey decks recently. So let's fire on in and see where we're going to put these decks. So the first deck here is Aqua Agro. So Aqua Agro is an interesting deck. It's fallen off a little bit since the release of our new back row cards. Aqua Agro was a very, very strong deck because it had the ability to put up multiple 2500 monsters and the ability to keep your life points high, which meant that a lot of the decks that would work to try and kill you very quickly couldn't really accomplish their game plan. But since the introduction of the barrier, this deck feels like it's fallen off a little bit. It still does see some play, but it does not see anywhere near as much play as it did, because it used to be, I think, arguably the best deck in the game, but that seems to be replaced, which is kind of the natural evolution of aggro, right? Aggro is basically Dragius plus good stuff pile, and as we put this into different kind of shells, it will evolve and change, and we will talk about some of the other aggro decks as we go through. As you can see, there's a lot of Dragius here, so there will be a lot of aggro decks that we're going to talk about, but as for this deck specifically, I think this is top of tier 3 / bottom of tier 2. I think this deck is good, but tournament-wise, we've only really been seeing one player really bringing this deck and representing it. And that, to be fair, it has been placing okay, but it hasn't been placing crazy well, which is the reason it's going to be in tier 3. Again, it's still a fine deck, and tier 3 doesn't mean it's terrible. It doesn't mean it's unplayable. Rogue is probably what that realistically means, but it's still a decent, okay strategy. I just think there are better ways to play the aggro strategy now. Next up, we have the Beatdown. Now, I think Beatdown is going to be towards the bottom of tier 3. So this is specifically talking about the Beatdown / Noodle Ninja / Tribute Boost deck that we've been seeing, which is primarily there just to stack a load of attack gain on attack gain on attack gain. It plays a bit like a combo deck where you want to assemble all your pieces, summon out your guys, make giant attack guys, and try and kill your opponent in one turn. It's fine. The problem this deck has is it can be a little bit inconsistent, and sometimes you will find yourself in a situation where you just don't have all the pieces you need and you just kind of fall over. The deck will win probably 1 in every 3 games, and that game it wins will be very, very explosive and it will look absolutely crazy, but those other 2 games it's going to struggle a little bit, which is why it's down at the bottom of tier 3. Next up, we're going to have our Blue Falcon formation. So this deck is a little bit of a meme. Obviously, it's in Rogue for a reason. To be honest, I'm not even really sure if we should still have this on the tier list, but it was on here from last time, so we thought we'd leave it in. It's not great, let's be honest. It's a bit of a joke deck. It's free-to-play friendly, kind of, and that's kind of one of the only things really going for it, so there's not really much to say about this. It's not topping any events. Nobody's even playing this deck. You see it occasionally on the ladder, and you almost always beat it. Next up, we have Pure Warriors. So Pure Warriors, for me, are probably tier 2. Now, Pure Warriors, this is the Dark Celerity Warriors. So this is Warriors without using the Red Eye skills. Warriors are decent. They have a decent amount of attack points. They have a decent amount of defense points. They have a decent strategy. You're able to get your opponent's life points using the Kime Ruler. You're able to use Piercing Samurai to get your opponent's life points via piercing damage. It also has its own trap card in Dark Ruler Battle Slash, which is really, really good. It's a better, usually, version of the barrier that also pops a back row, which can be really, really good. The reason this is in tier 2 is because I think there is a better version of this deck in the Red Eyes variant, but this deck is still fantastic. This deck is still being seen in tournaments, it's still topping, it's still doing very, very well, it's still a very annoying kind of stall / control strategy, and it still works very, very well. Next up, this represents Dragon Aggro. So Dragon Aggro is basically the 3 copies of Dragius, 2 copies of Ancient Arise Dragon, 1 copy of Prima-Gatana, and then kind of the Beast engine thrown in. Some people have called this like Beast Aggro, but I tend to try and name decks based after the boss monsters in them, so I consider this to be Dragon Aggro because the 2 primary monsters in it are dragons, and the aggro bit still comes from the fact it's Dragius plus Prima, so Dragon Aggro. So this deck is very, very powerful. This was the deck that the #1 player from the Goha Rush Festival was playing. And ever since that deck got released, everyone has been playing it. Every single tournament that I see, people are jamming this deck en masse. And a lot of the people that are doing very well with it have not changed a single card. Everyone is using the exact same build from that same GRF player. So it seems like it's already been mastered pretty much. And until we get a new box come out, this is probably going to be the strongest deck in Rush Duel. Next up, we have Dragonic Resonance. And Resonance, although it keeps getting hit, is still very strong. It's kind of fallen off from where it was. It used to be topping all the time. It used to be winning most of the time. It's fallen off a little bit since then. It hasn't really won anything super recently. It still does top, but not as much as it was. It's still a fine deck. Being able to pop your opponent's back row is still very, very strong. Being able to sort out the cards that you need is still very strong. Being able to do the 4800 combo and kill your opponent from 4800 is still really good, which is basically using your Dragonic Pressure to send 3 cards, bring back Sports Dragon effect, summon another guy, tribute 2, summon out of 2300, summon out of 15, use your Dragonic Resonance skill, boost both of them up, bam, 4800 direct damage, which is really good. And especially with the prevalence of back row, including Widespread Ruin, having Slayer is really, really good. And this deck is still very, very strong. Next up, we have Dragon Casters. So this is basically another form of like the aggro deck, I guess. This is basically the original good stuff pile, and it's fallen off a little bit. We don't really see Dragon Casters anywhere in tournaments. Like, nobody is basically playing this deck. If people are playing aggro variants, either they're playing the Aqua Agro or they're playing the Dragon Agro. But Dragon Casters is still an okay deck. Like, it's not completely terrible. It's just now probably the worst of the aggro variants that we've been seeing. So it's fallen off a little bit down into tier 3. Next up, we have our Noodles. This is kind of pure Noodles with our Noodle skill. So this is like fire beatdown, I guess. Realistically, this is just a worse version of beatdown. So that's why it's going to be down in Rogue. Again, you can still do stuff with it. You can still do the same kind of big attack plays. It just feels weaker than the tribute boost beatdown variation. Next up, we have OG Aggro. Now, OG Aggro, this was around pretty much for like the first week of Duel Links. This hasn't really been seeing much resurgence. So again, should probably be taken off the list realistically. But even a deck that was good on week 1 is still kind of okay to this day, and that's just because of the prevalence of the power of Prima Katana plus Dragius. Basically, if you get a Dragius and boost its attack by a ton, it's still very, very scary and very, very difficult for your opponent to deal with. The only problem being that Prima Katana is a card you do not want to see early game. You want to see this card as late as possible when you're going in for your big pushes with the Dragius to try and end games, because if you can get your Dragius over 3000 or at least up to 3000, it becomes a menace to your opponent because they can't even protect themselves using cards like the Barrier. So very, very strong even to this day. Next up, we have Pure Rebels. And Pure Rebels, I'm going to put at top of tier 2 for now. Pure Rebels is still very strong. Again, still seeing a lot of tops. This deck seems really, really popular. I think a lot of people really like the Royal Rebels. Pure Rebels is still really, really cool. But again, it's in tier 2 because I do think Red Eyes Rebels does eke it out a little bit. Red Eyes Rebels has been performing better than this deck. And I think just having the ability to keep getting Red Eyes and weaken your opponent's monsters is a really big consistency boost that this deck really does kind of need. Speaking of Red Eyes Rebels, we're going to put this up in tier 1. Red Eyes is a very strange card. People, I think, originally wrote Red Eyes off as not going to be very good, but the skill that Red Eyes came with was extremely good, and we've seen 2 or 3 decks definitely be able to take advantage of this and make their already decent strategies even better. So being able to spam out a level 7 monster is actually really good, especially when you need to tribute high level monsters to get off your own monster's effects. As well as the fact that just being able to get out multiple large bodies is kind of a weakness of the Royal Rebel deck. You tend to summon out a bunch of guys and then tribute them off for other guys, and you end up not having that many bodies on your board. A lot of the time you'll end on kind of just a single copy of Heavy Metal. So being able to use the Red Eyes and the Red Eyes Chick to get it out does work quite well. And then we have Red Eyes Warriors. Now, where do I think this? I think this is probably going to go behind Red Eyes Rebels. It has been performing a little bit worse than Red Eyes Rebels overall in the tournaments we've been seeing, but it's still very good. So in a similar way to how Red Eyes really helps out the Rebels, it does also really help out the Warriors. So Warriors do kind of struggle a lot of the time to get over 2500 attack monsters. They're very good defensively. They're not necessarily very good offensively. So if your opponent, for example, is also playing 2500 attackers, it's really good to be able to use the Red Eye skill to weaken your opponent's monsters to be able to get to them. So Red Eye's Warriors is genuinely just a really strong strategy right now, and is reflected by how well it's been doing in tournaments. Next up, we have SAR. So SAR is a deck that had sort of fallen off a little bit. It was originally one of the strongest decks. I myself did win a tournament with it back at the start of Rush Duel's release, but it has since fallen off quite a lot. We did see a handful of people in the Goha Rush Festival, though, playing this with the Beast engine, and we have seen people continue to bring this to tournaments, and it has been topping quite a lot recently. So SAR still hanging in there. I don't think this deck is ever really going to reach the heights it once had, but it seems to consistently be remaining a tier 2 meta threat. We're still seeing it on the ladder, we're still seeing it in tournaments, it's still doing quite well. Next up, we have Ride Across, and you know this has got to be the tiers. No, this is a rogue deck. This deck is awful. The Ride Across deck, especially in its pure form with the skill, is very, very bad. Now, it's very fun to play, right? Having a lot of these moving pieces is very fun, but the deck has too many high-level monsters. A lot of these high-level monsters have too bad a stats for them to be worth using. You can get wins with this deck. You can get wins with any deck in Rush. Is this going to consistently be winning? No. Is this going to get you to King of Games? I mean, you probably could if you grinded long enough. Is this deck going to win a tournament? Realistically, not. Until we get more support for Ride Across, it's not really going to do anything, and the only support it's ever really going to receive is going to be its fusion. So until we get fusions out, Ride Across, I think, is going to be pretty much dead. Next up, we have Dark Magician, and we're going to put it around here. Dark Magician, again, should it even be on this list? I mean, we have the rogue section for a reason, so why not? Dark Magician is a deck that has actually been rising in popularity, and I think that's because Dark Magic Attack is such a good tool to deal with your opponent's back row. So because of that, Dark Magician does see an okay amount of play. Is it a good deck? Not really. It still kind of caps out at just being a bunch of 2500 attack guys that don't really do anything, but with the ability to pop your opponent's back row sometimes. So realistically, it's not very strong. It's not very good. It's not really seeing any tournament play. It's fine. And then we have everybody's favorite Vault Condor. So this is a deck that everyone had a lot of hype for at the start of Duel Links. Vault Condor never really did anything in the physical version of Rush Duel until we got the much, much, much later support, which is still kind of fresh to the game as I speak. But in Duel Links, with the skill, there was a bit of hope behind this card. Unfortunately, it kind of fell flat. This deck can still pop off if you're able to amass a lot of cards, but you kind of need more than 5 cards in hand for this to work. So if you get into a stall fest with your opponent where neither player wants to do anything and just keep drawing cards, it can do quite well. The problem is, how often does that happen? Not very, so it ends up falling flat most of the time. Next up, we have Explosion Drive. And Explosion Drive, again, is a deck that can do some stuff, does see a little bit of play, never really see it in tournaments though, it's just kind of a fun ladder deck. Realistically, it's just as bad as most of the other stuff down here in Rogue, and probably shouldn't be played, but it's quite a fun alternative option. Next up, we have Disco Fever. So this is pure Aquas. This is using the skill Disco Fever to boost up your Aqua monsters, but you can only have Aqua monsters in your deck, which does make it very limited. The main issue with this deck is that we only have one Aqua boss monster at the moment, that being Diankito the Boogie Master, and just having one boss monster is not good enough for Rush. Unfortunately, we need at least one more so we can play 6 copies of high-level monsters for this to see any kind of play. But it was doing okay before. We haven't really seen it since then, but I do think it is better than a lot of these other rogue decks. It is still tournament viable, even though I don't think it's ever really going to be topping at the moment, but it's still fine. I think realistically, it's better than the decks underneath it, so that's why we're going to put it at the bottom of tier 3. Next up, we have Beast Gear. Now, Beast Gear needs more support. We're going to put this in rogue for now. I've seen some people say that they're using Forest to try and make this card work. I don't think Forest is a very good card in this deck. Realistically, Beast Gears are almost kind of past their prime already. Without the field spell, the deck ends up feeling very underwhelming, and also lacking a lot of options to change our opponent's monster to defense mode, such as Stop Attack, which is a card that was released alongside the Beast Gears back in the physical game, does hurt this deck quite a lot. Basically, this deck is either try and cheat out Kong and then use Kong's effect to pop defense monsters, which can be okay, or it's try and get out Lyogun and then use Lyogun to try and wipe your opponent's board. But most of the time, Lyogun isn't actually going to clear your opponent's board, and even when it does, it's not going to like kill them. So it ends up feeling a little bit lackluster no matter how you use it. So Beast Gear right now, definitely going to be a rogue deck. I think when they get their field spell, maybe they can get up to like tier 3. I don't think they're going to get much higher than that without a really good skill. Next up, we have Bender Break and another Yuga skill. And again, it's going to go into the bin. Bender Break is pretty bad. We are getting an update to Tempest Drive, which will let us use the boost on monsters that weren't summoned that same turn, which is a pretty good boost to this deck. It will also let you use it on Bender Break after it's been summoned using Beast Summoner, which you could not do before, which is another little boost, but I still don't think this deck's really going to be doing much. It still feels rather lackluster. It's just in a bit of a mess right now. It's in struggle street. I don't think this deck's going to be doing anything meaningful anytime soon, and it is a shame that you have to get 3 box URs to build this deck when it is so bad. Next up, this is going to be our Ancient Forces. And Ancient Forces, I think, is tier 2. Ancient Forces obviously did get hit by the ban list, which did suck quite a bit. And since then, hasn't really been seeing a ton of play. We've barely been seeing this in any events whatsoever. But I do think Ancient Forces is still a good deck. It still has a lot of potential. It's just a lot of the time, if you want to be playing the Ancient Arise Dragon, people will just be playing it alongside Dragius. And then in that case, they might as well just be playing the Dragon Aggro deck. So I still think it's good. Being able to boost your level 6 monsters is still pretty useful. You can still get over things like Yamirula Lock using this, and being able to destroy your opponent's monsters that have 1500 less defense is also really good. That being said, our new deck, our Ace Breaker, our Light Machines, our Ultimate Flag deck, their boss monsters have 1600 defense, so the release of this deck does naturally hurt Ancient Forces, which is a bit of a shame, but this deck is still decent. I still think this deck is strong, and I still think this deck could top tournaments quite easily. And then finally, we do have our Light Machines, and these are going to go top of tier 2 for me. So we've only had 1 tournament since these have come out, so this is very, very fresh take, but this did win that tournament and did also break top 4. So there were 2 in the top 4. Very, very good showing from this deck, but again, people might not have been used to it yet. It might have caught people off guard. People might not have learned how to play against it just yet. So we're going to leave it at top of tier 2 for now. I don't think it's quite right to be like, oh, it's a tier 1 meta threat. This deck is strong. It still does have a lot of very interesting tools. It can unbrick itself. You can boost your attack up to 3500, which is pretty good. If you're able to protect your Ace Breaker for a turn, so if you're able to protect it using anything like a Widespread, or if you're able to keep it alive using the Barrier, or using King's Majesty, just keeping this thing around till it gets to your turn, you can fill up your hand with cards, is really, really powerful, because then you can start discarding those monsters and popping your opponent's board, which is really, really good. This deck does have one major flaw in that it really struggles to get to your opponent's life points without the Rhino, but Rhino is really not worth playing, so that's a bit of a shaky one. But a lot of these other decks also lack that kind of ability, such as the Royal Rebels, and they still manage to play just fine. So all in all, I think this is where I like everything. This represents what I think the meta looks like right now. We are seeing mostly the Dragon Aggro decks winning tournaments and topping events, followed by the Resonance, and then our Red Eyes variants of these decks. We've only had 1 tournament so far with the Light Machines in, but so far they've been performing quite well. We then have our pure variants of the Rebels and the Warriors, which again are still topping. They're still being seen a lot in tournaments. They're just not really winning very much at the moment. SCR is still hanging in there and doing actually quite well for itself. Forces, again, has somewhat dropped off the face of the planet. I'm not sure why everyone has just kind of stopped playing this deck, but I still think this deck's pretty strong. Then we have Aqua Agro, which is hanging in there just about. Dragoncasters, again, just nobody seems to be playing this, but it still seems strong enough. I suppose the main reason you wouldn't play it is because this is basically just an aggro build. Like, all 3 of these decks are arguably very, very similar to each other, as well as the number 1 best deck, and this is just the best way to play this deck, so people have just gone onto that. Beatdown, again, is a very funny strategy. Whenever it comes out, everyone always cheers. Whenever it's on stream in a tournament, people are always really excited to see it. But a lot of the time it kind of explodes and doesn't end up doing anything. And then the pure Aquas, again, a little bit of a struggle streak, but these might actually get a little bit of a boost with the return of the Mimi event and some of the new Mimi support cards. Fingers crossed something happens there, and that could also boost the Aqua Aggro build. All these Deck and Rogues are still in struggle streak. Ride Across is a complete and total joke. In fact, most of the Yuga skills seem to be a complete and total farce. So hopefully my boy Yuga gets some boost in the future, because right now he's really struggling. So this is where I think everything stands. Feel free to leave a comment down below and tell me what you agree with, what you disagree with, which of my takes were completely terrible and which ones were fantastic. I would love to hear from you, and I always like to read the comments and get back to you. So thanks for watching the video, and I'll see you next time.